Good morning, church, and a very happy Sabbath to you all. Today is the first Sabbath of 2021. It's a new year that has dawned. For many people, I think it's a year that everyone will hope will be better than 2020. It's a time of the year when many people make New Year's resolutions. A time when they want to recommit their lives to the Lord and form a relationship with Him that will take them through this coming year. And our theme this morning is communication, as we've heard with our children's story, communicating with God, having a good relationship with Him. So I'm going to share my screen with you. And there we go. That's our title for this morning, is Be Still and Know that I am God. Psalms 46 verse 10. And as humans, we communicate in a variety of ways. Obviously, the most common one being verbal, talking to one another. But we also communicate through other means, through writing, through words, through pictures. And especially even now with COVID, we have probably found that some elements of communication have been hampered. We are forced to wear masks, which hides our faces. But even though you might have a mask, when you look at a person's eyes, you can still see them smiling. So we can communicate without being verbal. And many people, especially married couples that have known each other for a long time, can be in a room on the opposite sides of the room. They can share a glance to one another, and yet they can get that form of communication of not being comfortable here, I want to go home, or whatever. And yet no words have been spoken, yet they can communicate with each other. We also find, as a result of COVID, that we as a church are missing a very essential part of our communication, and that is touch. We miss hugging each other. We miss embracing and feeling the warmth of that love. So communication with us as humans takes on a variety of forms. And I'd like to share with you something which is very interesting. And I had often wondered what it would have been like in the Garden of Eden when God created Adam, whether that form of communication that He had made between Himself and God, they could talk one-to-one, whether that communication went towards His other forms of creation, the birds and the fish and the animals. Could Adam speak freely and communicate freely with those animals? It's something that we're going to have a little bit to look at a bit later on, because we all discover that communication is very, very important to God. And we're going to discover some very interesting facts. Something that we can look forward to in the new heaven is being able to maybe talk to the animals and God's creation. Now, God's creation, He talks to us through His word, God's Bible, the spoken word. But God also has nature, and nature can speak to us in volumes. You speak to anybody that has been in the bush or in the country, they will tell you that nature speaks a lot. And quite often on our farm in South Africa, we would have livestock that would go missing. When we rounded them up, the bush was thick, and it would take hours and sometimes even days to find missing animals. I'm not just talking about one or two, I'm talking 20, 30, 40 would go missing, and we wouldn't be able to find them. And they would be in the bush. And so we had what we call in South Africa, in Afrikaans, spoor, S-P-O-O-R, spoor. These are animal tracks. And over 30 odd years of farming and tracking in the bush, you learn, or I learned to read the signs that nature was giving me. So much so that I could walk along a road and I could see some animal tracks. And I could say, this animal has come from this direction. He's eaten under this tree and he's gone off in that direction. And that this animal is a male, it's not a female. I'll tell you the species that it is. And also that its back left leg is injured. And I could read all those signs just by looking at the footprints and what was around me. Very interesting. And I'd like to share with you some things that you can learn from nature. Obviously, here, if I can get you this, yeah, you can see that these are your typical antelopes. All of them are different. And obviously, we had to tell the difference between a sheep and a goat and a kudu and a springbuck and whatever else there was there. So we had to learn the different footprints. But if you have a look here, this one at the top is a hyena. Now, a hyena is the dog family. Notice it's got little claw marks. A jackal, which we often had, also dog family, claw marks. A wild dog, also claw marks. Now, you compare that to, say, for example, the lion. Lion is cat family. No claw marks because cats retract their nails. No claw marks there. Leopard, no claw marks. Serval cat, no claw marks. Caracal, no claw marks. And so you can see there's a difference between a cat and a dog. But there's also something else that's very interesting. Cat family, if you look at the bottom here by the lion, has two little indentations. Same as the leopard, two little indentations. Same as the serval cat, two little indentations. You have a look at the hyena, the dog family, it's just one. The jackal, it's just one. The wild dog, it's just one. So you can see that very easily by looking at the spoor, what type of animal there is. But now have a look at this little chap. Here we have claw marks. Tells us it's the dog, a dog family. But when we have a look underneath, we have two little indentations, which tells us it's the cat family. Every rule have exceptions. And this was an exception to the rule by most accounts. This is a cheetah. We all know that cheetahs belong to the cat family. But this is the only cat which has non-retractable claws. As you can see there, the claw prints are there. So it's the cat family. So as you go through nature, you learn the signs that are there. And by looking and studying the signs, it tells you a picture, a very interesting picture. Now, in Africa, there's there is a group of people who have mastered the skill of tracking. And these are known as the San or the Bushmen. They're very small people, very fine features. I would say height-wise, they're probably smaller than the average Western teenager, but exceptional at tracking. As you can see in this picture here, they're obviously tracking an antelope, but they would have the skill to be able to follow one particular animal amongst all these footprints. That's how good they were. And if we have a look at during the Bush War in South Africa, the South African Defence Force employed the Bushmen as trackers, because they needed somebody to track. As you can see, the terrain was very unforgiving, and it was very difficult to track terrorists in this environment. Yet a Bushman could follow a broken blade of grass or an overturned stone, and he'll be able to track them. And as we look here, we find the very fine features of the Bushman, short in stature. And this is obviously during the war years. And they, as a little caption says there, the Bushman soldiers and their families were resettled in Smitsdrift. Now, Smitsdrift was one place where I was deployed for a time period. So communication, when we look at it, tells us a lot about the environment where we are, the signs we can read it as a picture. But how does communication fit in with the rest of God's creation? Let's just have a look at this. This is a sight that I think we all know. Do birds communicate with one another? Most definitely. We've all heard a flock of geese honking towards one another, encouraging that leader, keep going, you're in the right direction, or whatever they say to each other. But birds, part of God's creation, communicate with one another. And this started to make me wonder, what about the fish of the sea? Do they communicate with one another? Oops. You know, here's a humpback whale. And those of you that have done a bit of research knows that a humpback whale have a most peculiar way of communicating. That they can communicate over hundreds of miles at a decibel level of 190 decibels. And that is loud. And sound travels in water very well. And scientists have recorded speeds of 1 mile a second for sound to travel underwater. So we find that the fish of the sea, God's creation, communicate with one to another. What about the animal kingdom? Can animals communicate one to another? Well, this is a very interesting one, because elephants, all animals communicate with each other. I mean, we have lions, we have jackals, we have all sorts of animals within their breed talk to one another. But elephants are something that I think fascinates a lot of people, because human beings cannot hear the low frequencies that elephants can communicate at. The average human has a range for hearing between 20 and 20,000 hertz. But elephants can communicate between 14 and 24 hertz at a volume of 80 to 90 decibels. Now, to put that into English, 80 to 90 decibels is for us humans being present at a rock concert or standing next to a bulldozer when it's working as a machine. Yet elephants can communicate over tens of kilometers at that level, and yet we as humans cannot even hear it. So communication within the animal kingdom is very important. And this is what made me think, as a result of sin in the Garden of Eden, did man lose that ability to be able to communicate with God's creation? Let's have another look. What about the insect kingdom? You know, bees. I'm a bee farmer. I used to farm with them, and they fascinate me. And a queen bee quacks and toots to the swarm. So she's constantly in communication with the rest of the hive. And the hive will always be present. The swarm will always be present when they can hear the queen. When they can't hear the queen, then they will leave. But it's interesting the way a scout bee goes out and he finds a tree in blossom. And he'll come back to the hive and he'll do what they call the waggle dance. And he will show you here, he will come along into the hive and then he will go in the direction of the tree or the food source, and he will do this little waggle dance. 1 second is 1 kilometer away. So he's telling all the bees around him, there's food 1 kilometer away in this direction. That is communication. And you know, we've looked at so much. We've looked at the birds, we've looked at animals, we've looked at fish, we've looked at insects. This is what God created. But you know, God also created the trees. And I started to think, can trees communicate? Do you think a tree can communicate to another tree? And very interestingly, I'll show you this. This is what we called speckworm. If I translate it into English, it's a bacon tree. Speck is bacon. Or the English word was elephant bush. As you can see, it's very succulent in its leaves. And we had quite a bit of this on the farm. If you were walking in the bush and you got thirsty, you could take a few of these leaves and chew them, and it will just bring a bit of moisture to your mouth. Very interesting, because this particular bush, it grows as a bush, but it also grows as a big tree. And it has a beautiful pink flower. But our farm was in an area, this is typical of our, what we called our veld. It was very prone to droughts. And during the droughts, many of us farmers noticed that these antelope, which are kudu, beautiful spiral horns, they were dying during the droughts. And yet all around them, all around the farm, was full of the speckworm. Here you can see the speckworms all around these kudu, and yet they were dying. And we couldn't understand why. They were skin and bones. They were literally starving. And so they went to the local university and they got some professors from the botany department, and they came out and said, listen, please try and find out what's going on. Is this 2 species of this speckworm that are growing here? Because the animals are not eating it, and they're eating one type, but not the other type. And it's very clearly, you know, some have been eaten and some hasn't been eaten. And after various trials and tests, and this took a number of seasons and years, they came back and they marked certain bushes and certain trees and did chemical analysis on them. And they came back and said, no, these trees are very different. The chemical makeup is very different. Some have very high levels of a chemical called tannin, and others are mild. But he said the genetic makeup of the tree is identical. There's not 2 species, but there's a difference between them. And then they would come back a few months later to the same marked trees, and they would find a completely different chemical composition of the leaves. And the ones that were very high in tannin previously were now palatable, and vice versa. And this really puzzled them. And they eventually came and they said to us, you know, we've found out what's the problem. And this has now been proved on other plants and trees. Another one is the acacia karoo, thorn tree, which another one, these antelope, they love that tree. That in actual fact, trees communicate with one another. And what was happening was, under normal conditions, the kudu, for example, would come down and they would start eating on these lower bushes. And as a form of defense, these bushes would, to protect themselves from being defoliated, would produce a chemical called tannin, which made the leaves extremely bitter, and the kudu would leave them. So it was a form of self-defense. But not just protect themselves. What they would do is that these bushes would make something called ethylene. And ethylene it's like it's a hormone, but it's like a pheromone. And it would be secreted out through the leaves into the air. And the wind would take this chemical, this pheromone in the air, and it'll deposit it on other bushes 10, 20, 30, 40 meters away. These other bushes would then absorb this SOS signal and in turn start producing tannin in their leaves. It takes about 15 minutes to get the bush chemical changed within the chemical balance changed within the bush. And so by the time the kudu moved up the mountain or up the slope to eat on the other bushes, they'd already produced enough tannin to make their leaves bitter. And this is why when us farmers came along, we couldn't understand why the bushes were being left and yet they were so palatable previously. It was constantly changing. And as a result of this information, we then could change our farming habits and maybe put out food for the animals or something. But when I hear things like this in nature, I realize that we serve an all-powerful God who created everything, and that there's communication with nature within itself. And something like this shows a signature of a loving creator and a system of communication which could never have evolved. This is God creating nature to communicate with itself. So communication is very important to God. And we being the crowning glory of his creation, obviously it's very important that we can be able to communicate with our God. And we have a number of examples within the Bible where God spoke directly to man. We've got Adam, and Moses, and Joshua, and Samuel, and Paul. But he also used dreams in which to communicate with man, like with Solomon or David or Joseph. And maybe for many of us, we are wanting direction in our lives as we start this new year. And we wish we could have a very audible voice from God. Go in this way, or do this. But the truth is, we're not likely to have that happen. Neither are we likely to see a big neon flashing light in the skies saying, this is the way, go ye in it. But Isaiah says, it's a beautiful passage. Isaiah 30, verse 20 and 21 says, but your eyes shall see your teachers. Your ears shall hear a word behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. Whether you turn to the right hand or whether you turn to the left. Yes, God does speak in audible tones for us humans many times, but he also leaves words and clues and direction for us in his word. Just like the Bushmen, they were so in tune with their environment, with their surroundings, that they could get a picture of what was happening with them, what was happening all around them, what animals were moving or where they were moving. And they were so in tune and being able to communicate with nature and vice versa that they got direction. And so that could be just the same for us. If we could immerse ourselves in God's word and make that our environment, we could find the little golden nuggets, the little spoor here or there, follow that direction, and he could lead us down a path which is so beautiful. But all we need to look for is the links in his word, the encouragements, the direction, and we could have a level of communication with our Creator that will satisfy our every need. The quieter you are within yourself, the more distinct you'll hear the voice of God speaking to you. And don't let 2021 be a year where the world's news blocks out the sound of God. It's so easy to be caught up in the politics, the Brexits, the COVIDs, the wars of this world. It's so easy to have that all just bombard us that we can no longer hear the small voice of God. Elijah heard that voice. 1 Kings chapter 19 verse 11 says, "Go out and stand before me on the mountain," the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was a sound of a gentle whisper. Then Elijah heard it. He wrapped his face in his cloak, went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. God spoke to the prophet through a still, small voice. God didn't speak to him in the earthquakes and the windstorms and the fires of this world, but quietly. And the more you practice to listen for his voice, the more easily you will hear it. Communication is a two-way street. It's also praying and talking to God as if he were your best friend, just like Joshua with the story of Bugsy the ram. Praying to your Creator, a simple prayer. We have a beautiful passage in the Gospel of John, and I'm going to read this from the New Living Translation, John 16, verse 23 to 27. "At that time, you won't need to ask me for anything. I tell you the truth, you will ask the Father directly, and he will grant your requests because you use my name. You haven't done this before. Ask using my name, and you will receive, and you will have abundant joy. I've spoken these matters in figures of speech and parables, but soon I will stop speaking figuratively and will tell you plainly all about the Father. Then you will ask in my name. I am not saying I will ask the Father on your behalf, for the Father himself loves you dearly because you love me and believe that I came from God." What a wonderful invitation that we can come straight to the Father because of what Jesus has accomplished on Calvary. We have a direct line of communication with our Creator. And we can tell him all our fears, all our concerns, all our worries, whatever might come before you this coming year in 2021. You can come before your Father. You can come directly and pray in the name of Jesus, and he will hear you. So the challenge that I'd like to leave with you today, and hope that you will carry it with you through this coming year, is to have that relationship, that walk and talk relationship, that communication with your Father. He's given us so much, and his word and his nature are all around us. They're giving us clues. They are the spoor. And we just need to learn to read them, and we will get the direction. We will get the comfort. We will get that hope of a future. All we need to do is open what I call the bush eyes, be able to read the signs and read the spoor. So may 2021 be a year where you can, as David say in Psalms 46 verse 10, be still and know that I am God. Be still and listen to God's voice. He's wanting to communicate with you, and we can communicate with him. And so often our prayers is request, 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 but we don't give time for God to talk back to us. Be still and hear God's voice. Amen.